Hello, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural edition of the FreightWaves TV transmission show. I guess we'll call this episode First Gear. I mean, if we're in transmission, right, you got to shift from first to second. So we'll start here. My name is Sebastian Blanco. I am the new editor of the Transmissions newsletter and host of this show. And before we get too far into it, let me introduce my co-host for today, Grace Sharkey. How you doing today, Grace?
I am doing well. Thank you so much for asking, and thank you for letting me be on episode one. This is fun.
Yes, well, we are certainly going to try and have you here for more than just the one episode. But as someone who has worked with FreightWaves for a while, you know that one of the first things we got to do here is do an ad read to let everyone know why this episode is coming to them, who's providing, who's paying the bills. So here we go.
Most automakers rely on just-in-time manufacturing to optimize production. That model requires precise coordination throughout every link in the global supply chain, and that's where AIT Worldwide Logistics comes in. AIT's automotive logistics professionals are the experts at developing resilient, scalable solutions for OEM and Tier 1 supply chains across Asia, Europe, and North America. AIT has the expertise, technology, and carrier connections to achieve your production goals just in time. Check out their link in the show notes.
So speaking of episodes, this is the first one. We're still going to figure out how this show is going to go. But in general, we're going to start today with a few introductions. I've been an automotive reporter for about 15 years. Started in 2006 with a site called Autoblog and have written for a whole bunch of people since then. I've been freelance. I've been full-time, been all kinds of things in the industry. Everyone from New York Times and Car and Driver to some of the small green blogs like Clean Technica, Inside EVs. And my focus this whole time has been on electric vehicles, but I've covered all parts of the industry. So I will be bringing that perspective to us here on transmission, because one of the things that's certainly happening in the shipping trucking industry is alternative powertrains. How can that part of the industry change just like the rest of the automotive industry? And Grace, I'm going to let you introduce yourself a little bit. I know a little bit about you, but not as much as you know about yourself. So please tell me, tell the listeners, tell the viewers about yourself and what you think is going to happen here on Transmission Show.
Yeah, thank you so much. So my name is Grace Sharkey. I actually come from a very good background in logistics and freight brokerage here in actually the same area that we're both in, Grand Rapids, Michigan. Michigan, perfect state for us to talk about automotive, that's for sure. And I am going to help bring, especially this first episode, where the auto supply chain really connects with how different industries are moving into electric vehicles, or what type of changes these tier 1, 2s, and 3s are going to have to make in order to keep up with new standards. So I have actually a pretty good background in more of like tier 2, tier 3 transportation. So I'm excited to combine our two areas and see, what we can come up with and give people a real look into how this transformation is going to affect everyday pricing, et cetera. I think I love supply chain because it is a part of every single good thing around us, and automotive is just as big of a beast, especially here in Michigan around us, than any other supply chain in the United States. So this is going to be fun. I'm excited, and thank you again for letting me come on this episode.
Well, before we get into some of the things we sort of talked about that we were going to focus on, what you just said reminded me a lot of some of the things I saw happening in the electric vehicle industry, in that in the way that it's global, and then how that impacts the local side of things as well. So you're talking about Michigan. We do have obviously the automotive industry here, but things are happening all across the country. I was just down in Ohio this weekend. There's the Honda plant in Maryville. Like, things are happening all over the place. But when it comes to electric vehicles, you have, things that are advancing quite quickly. China's doing a whole bunch with their electric vehicles. Europe is pushing their things. And the impacts of sort of the building blocks of EVs, whether that's better cell technology, whether that's the materials that need to be mined in order to make these vehicles, those have a pretty dramatic impact on EVs across the world compared to an internal combustion engine or an ICE vehicle where, okay, companies have had, the auto industry has had over 100 years to figure out how to make an internal combustion engine, and someone might be able to improve it, make it more powerful, make it more efficient, whatever it is that the engineers are going for. But there's no more really big advances to be had there, at least not that we've seen in a while. With EVs, the rate of technological improvements are certainly growing rapidly, especially if you watched it for the last 15 years like I have. The batteries that were in the first, mass market electric vehicles like the Nissan Leaf compared to what they can do today is huge. And to bring that together with some of the ideas in, the supply chain, it seems like those same kind of things, the things that people can learn from different shippers, different companies around the world, can be translated into other places, but it can't be just instantly applied. Like, you don't want to just put the new best battery into any electric truck. You need to tune it for the right usage. So in what you've seen, Grace, what you've sort of been paying attention recently, is there a lot of that exchange happening with, okay, someone makes an advancement in one part of the world and then other companies are like, oh yeah, that I need to do over here as well? Or is there's still a big differences in regions in the way things are shipped and moved around?
I think that it's becoming more of an equal playing ground. I think everyone is starting to get on the same page that this is something that needs to happen. Now, I have seen individual states have maybe more stricter rules and emissions, like if you look at California or Massachusetts. So the interesting thing to me is that a lot of states have kind of avoided setting up suppliers within those areas because they're concerned with, can they find trucks to go into California that can actually back up the new emission laws. But most of the technology companies, even down to like robotics or contracted carriers, things of that nature, are starting to implement some type of like sustainability so that once these companies start rolling out the guidelines for suppliers on their emission policies, they are well prepared for that switch. So it's funny you say that. Like, I know clearly GM is huge on their emission standards. I think it's 2035, right? All of their vehicles will be EV. A lot of people have taken those type of announcements and really said, okay, this is something we need to do, not something that we should crunch numbers and choose to do. But it's time to crunch the numbers and figure out how we're going to prepare ourselves for this type of strategy.
Yeah, and the interesting thing too with General Motors specifically is it's an aspirational statement. They didn't say assuredly by 2035 all of our vehicles would be EV. They aspire to be carbon neutral by that point, or however they phrase it. I don't have it top of mind. But they have still put a marker in the sand for 15 or so years from now and said this is a target we want to hit. And you have announcements like this week with a new all-electric Silverado pickup truck. I believe I saw 400 miles of range. The pictures they showed, it looks like any other Silverado on the road at first glance. These are the kind of vehicles that will really change both, people's perceptions of what an EV can do and also what people will use EVs for. I mean, GM is certainly not the only one coming with an electric pickup truck, but when you start putting bigger motors, bigger battery packs into these bigger vehicles, that has a lot of implications, not just for the people using them for their daily use, but then also all of these, just people who need a bigger vehicle for their fleets or for whatever, shipping they're doing. It's not like this is a new thing in any way. I think I was hinting at this earlier, but before we started recording, but so I think in 2017, maybe 2018, a couple years ago, I went to, I believe it was the Work Truck Show down in Indianapolis. And it was my first time there. It was fascinating, got to see a lot of cool things, got to talk to a lot of cool people. But what I can never forget, and what was really strange, is when I go to an automotive event, one of these big things, because I've been covering this industry a long time, you see the same people, you see the same PR people, you see the same journalists, and that's great. It's fun. You get to learn a lot. But this is my first time at the Work Truck Show. I didn't have a lot of connections in the trucking space. But then I went to the various companies that were talking about some new electric platform that they could do, or a conversion they could do on, like an e-chassis or something like that. And they were names that I was familiar with. And I won't out them right now as people, but they were people who used to work for Tesla, or were used to work for some other electric vehicle startup that I was talking to 10 years ago in, 2007, 2009, whenever. And these were people who helped get those companies off the ground and helped work on some sort of engineering or technical aspect. And they were now doing the same for the trucking companies. So that was, to me, a really good sign that the changes that I saw, that people covering the EV industry and automotive industry in general saw for many years, is now happening inside the trucking industry. And this was much more, not really behind the scenes, but it's just not as flashy. I mean, if you can do like an electric powered, dump truck or a garbage truck, that doesn't get the same attention as a new Tesla. It might be more important in the end for actually making a change in emissions, because these can be some very dirty vehicles that are going through people's neighborhoods every single week. And if you can now make that quieter and electric, that makes a big difference. But to know that these same people were working on these projects was really kind of a cool thing to see.
So I think that one thing to point out is that while more of the trucking innovations in regards to EV or emissions exposure, that is becoming more of a sexier type of technology, because it's coming down from the different automakers. So a lot of these automakers, I think, are starting to enforce more of sustainability within their supply chain. And I think that's why you're starting to see these innovations more on the 18-wheeler semi-truck side of things, because they're understanding, okay, if I'm going to continue to help tier 3, tier 2 suppliers move different aspects, different raw materials to these plants, I'm going to have to be under the same standards that Ford or GM is now putting themselves under. I think the average automaker, 7%, 7 or 8% of their total greenhouse emissions within their total supply chain come from just the transportation, the truck side of things. So if you can somehow focus your attention on eliminating just even that 7%, the automakers are going to get much closer to that hopeful 2030, 2035 goals that they keep putting out. And at the end of the day, it's going to make a lot of trucking companies a lot more sustainable as a business model, because the issue is with fuel, if it goes up and down, your profits are going up and down as well. So you're telling me if I switch to more EV technology in my truck, that I'm going to be able to figure out my cost every year, every quarter, and be able to continue to work with these large suppliers or these large automakers, then that's something I'm going to have to start really thinking about. So I'm excited to see how more trucks transition into these type of vehicles. I think carriers are having a lot of issues with being able to move into states like California because of their new emission standards. So if I can just switch over and be able to figure out my cost and what my profit is going to be without having to worry about market exposure or anything more international affecting how much gas is, then why wouldn't I do that? So it's not sexy, but it's a big part of the overall supply chain of these automakers.
And I think we can really find the news of tomorrow in that non-sexy stuff. So the automakers might put out a press release that really talks about we're going to, reduce the carbon footprint of our supply chain, of our, the real well to wheels of how they make a vehicle. That does not get big headlines. We know this. That's understandable. Most people don't care. Like Patton Oswalt has that really funny routine about how he doesn't really like episode 1 because we don't really need to know where Darth Vader came from. He can just be a mean guy with a cool red lightsaber. But then George Lucas went and made a whole series of movies with a little kid. So people don't necessarily need to know why GM is being carbon neutral by 2035. But if you want to get there somehow, you do need to look at all of these pieces. And I've read plenty of press releases and corporate sustainability reports and other things like that really get into, okay, Volvo is reducing water usage at one plant, or Audi, whichever one it was recently that I saw, but they are going to talk to their suppliers about reducing water at their plants as well, so that in the final reckoning, the numbers come down for everyone. And of course, like you said, that's going to hit the trucking companies, the fleet companies as well, just because it's all part of one picture. And people are kind of starting to put that together now. We've been able to externalize a lot of these things in the past, and that is becoming less and less of an option as people recognize, well, if we do this but don't do this, are we really doing anything at all? We're going to talk about one more thing before we kind of wrap up for the day, and that is between when we're recording and when this episode will drop, there is going to be the FreightWaves Enterprise Fleet Summit. And let's just briefly talk about some of the things we saw there. The thing that jumped out to me was autonomous vehicles, autonomous trucks. That is, of course, another huge part of the automotive industry where that technology isn't instantly transferable. You can't just use the same stuff that you wanted put on a sedan and put it on a semi-truck, because the sensors have to be recalibrated and all that kind of thing for the height difference. And, you have to program things differently so that whatever braking distance you write into the code for a 2,000-pound vehicle becomes a very different number when you're dealing with an 18-wheeler. Just the numbers have to be different. But in general, a lot of these technologies can be adapted for the different vehicles. So that caught my eye. What were some of the things that struck your eye that's like, oh, that's going to be an interesting thing, not just for the summit, which again, we're not going to be able to talk about because of the timing, but just moving forward with transmissions, with some of the things you're sort of looking for in the industry. What catches your eye these days?
So I'm excited for a couple of our speakers that actually head fleets, pretty large fleets as well, to hear from them and what type of sustainability efforts they're adding to their fleets in order to hopefully keep up with a lot of these new initiatives. I think what's really interesting, and I believe Sarah has a couple of things that they're working on, is more of the tracking capabilities, being able to actually pull a report and tell these customers, hey, this is what we've improved on. Here is the actual data behind that. What sometimes makes me nervous with this transformation is it's something that I think larger fleets and larger carriers can handle and transition into. But there's a lot of people, especially in this type of market where carriers are able to name their price, there's a lot of people that are investing in new trucks. And I hope that they're investing in some type of EV vehicles, because my biggest fear is that these companies would start getting up and running, and now they're starting to take on larger customers or larger clients, and they're not ready for this type of requirement that might soon be upon them. And to start a new business and know that there's certain states that you can't even run into because of emission laws, it's going to be incredibly frustrating. So people have been able to enter and exit the carrier side of things pretty easily. Maybe not exit, but definitely enter. And I get concerned sometimes that in these type of market environments that carriers are going to kind of jump into it, say, hey, I'm gonna become an owner operator. I'm gonna get my own truck. I'm able to do it. Banks are giving me the loans. And 2 or 3 years from now, their biggest customer says, hey, we have to cut you because your emission standards are up to par. So I'm excited to see how some of these different technologies and tools are giving carriers the power to actually report this so that they can be a certified supplier for these automakers.
So what you're saying, we're talking about electrification, autonomous driving, and future rules about climate change. None of that will be news. This will be the first and last episode of the Transmissions Show. So we're done here. Good job, everyone. Yeah. So no, there's a bunch to talk about, and we'll keep an eye on it as best we can.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'd love to do an episode about even the mining side. That stuff gets very crazy. So you should have a fun time on the show.
Yeah, no, this is going to be great. And with that, I believe we will wrap up the inaugural edition, first gear here on Transmissions. Have multiple meetings, but that's good. Grace, thank you so much for joining us today. And we will definitely be back again next week. I believe new episodes will drop every Tuesday. And if that's wrong, we'll update you in the next episode, which will, I guess, be called Second Gear, because that's how we do these things now. Thank you for watching, everyone, and we will see you next time on Transmissions.